At every single county jail you go to in processing, when you're filling out the paperwork and talking to the processing person, the cop, the guard, whatever you want to call it, behind the counter, they ask you, do you have any drug problems? And my answer was, well, yes. Well, what drug problems do you have? Alcohol, cocaine. I need all the help I can get. Now, here's the thing. I didn't start drinking until I was 34. Don't use drugs, never have used drugs, because my mother was an addict. Yeah, I didn't want to be like that bullshit, so I was scared to death of drugs until I was in my mid-30s. At that point in time, once my wife leaves, I started to drink, and believe you me, I tried the best I could to make up for lost time. But at this point in time, this is what I'm telling every place that I stop. Drugs, cocaine, alcohol. So by the time I get to Columbia, South Carolina, I've got a paper trail of drugs. This guy is requesting help. This guy needs help. Now, my lawyer was none other than Strom Thurmond's son, Paul Thurmond. Now, if you guys don't know who Strom Thurmond is, Strom Thurmond was this racist senator way back in the 19-whenevers that launched the longest filibuster ever. I mean, he was hardcore next gen. That's this guy. Dead now. His son was my lawyer. Until I got to Columbia, South Carolina. At which point, they informed me that, well, Brett, you cannot pay for a lawyer with stolen funds. And I'm like, and? Well, they made me drop him. Well, they didn't make me drop him. They dropped him for me. And they gave me this public pretender. No, I didn't say defender. I said public pretender. He looked exactly like Billy D. Williams from the malt liquor commercials. I mean, the Jerry Curl, everything else. That's this guy. He actually did one good thing for me. The one good thing he did, as they're doing the arraignment, he asked the judge if the judge will order a psychological evaluation. Why I would need a psychological evaluation, I'm sure I don't know. You guys can probably tell I'm completely normal. Anyway, the judge says yes. Psychologist comes to the county jail. It's a 4-hour interview. About halfway through, psychologist looks at me. He's like, do you use any type of drugs? Yes. What do you use? Cocaine and alcohol. Cocaine. Do you smoke or snort? Snort? How much? An 8-ball a day. And he looks at me, and I look at him, and we're silent. Finally, he's like, that's a lot. And I'm like, yeah. He's like, do you have any trouble out of that? And I was like, yeah. He's like, what? And I was like, I can't get an erection. And he looks at me, and I look at him. Now, I had gotten that from watching the movie Boogie Nights. Those who have not seen it, Mark Wahlberg is this porn star. In the end scene, he's done so much cocaine that he can no longer stand to attention. And I figured that shit had to be right. I tell this psych that. He's looking at me. I'm looking at him, completely silent. Finally, I break the silence. Is that right? And he looks at me, and he was like, it could happen. Is it still happening now? And I looked at him. I was like, nope, working fine. Not that I needed to where I am. So that makes it into my pre-sentence report. Federal sentencing. Before you go in front of the judge, because here's the thing. If you get indicted federally, your ass is going to plead guilty. If you do not plead guilty, you are suffering from FIS. FIS, fucking idiot syndrome. So most people, 87% plead out because that's the smart move. Before you go in front of the judge, before he gives you time, the probation office and the prosecutor's office, they sit their little monkey asses down and they do an in-depth background check on you that tells the judge how much time the judge needs to give you behind the fence. That drug stuff makes it into my pre-sentence report. Now, while this is going on, I am absolutely adamant that I am not going to stick around if they sentence me to any more than 60 months. My guidelines were 60 to 75 months. And I was like, you know what? I'll do 60 months as long as they give me the drug program, and I'll be just fine. I'll get out, I'll set up shop again, and I'll be all right. Sentencing day. The prosecutor is literally screaming. And he's screaming this. Johnson has manipulated the prosecutor. Johnson has manipulated the Secret Service. And Johnson is manipulating you today, Your Honor. We demand the upper limits of the guidelines. The judge looks over at me and she says, I agree. 75 months. I look over at my lawyer. I was like, can you get the drug program for me? He stands up. Will you order the drug program for Mr. Johnson? The judge says no, but I'll recommend he gets evaluated for it. I look at my lawyer. What does that mean? My lawyer, you're probably not going to get it. My exact words. How soon can you get me to the camp? And he looks at me and he's like, well, if you don't appeal, I can get you there pretty quick. And I was like, my exact words again. I was like, you know what? Fuck the appeal. Get me to the camp. I'll take it from there. He looks at me like I'm the biggest idiot in the world. 6 weeks later, I'm at the camp. Now, I had family and friends look for minimum security camps that were not supposed to have a fence because I was sentenced to more than 60 months and I was not planning on staying. So I picked Ashland, Kentucky, not supposed to have a fence. Pull up to Ashland, Kentucky 6 weeks later, 14-foot fence, razor wire on top. I'm like, well, shit, I can't climb that. Go in. As I'm talking to the processing guard, I ask him, I was like, hey, man, are there any jobs outside of the fence? And he looks at me, he's like, well, yeah, you can work in the National Forest. And I was like, no, I'll die out there. And he's like, well, you could always work landscaping. And I was like, well, shit, I can run a weed eater. So the next week, I walk into the landscaping office. And the guard, the office, back behind him, like back behind me, back behind him, the entire wall is a blown up photo of the compound in the outline area. So I can literally sit there and plot my escape as I'm talking to him. While this is going on, my dad starts to visit. And I love my dad. My dad passed away October 2nd. You guys who have watched my show, I did an episode speaking the death of my father. But I hadn't talked to my dad. I mean, really talked to the man. I hadn't talked to him in, 20-some years, maybe longer than that. He shows up at my sentencing, tells the judge I can live with him when I get out and wants me to get a good start. He starts to visit me in prison. Third visit. He looks at me, he's like, I've been reading a lot about you online. I'm like, yeah. He's like, yeah. He's like, that's a lot of money you made. And I was like, yeah. He's like, do you think you can teach someone how to do that? Now, the truth of the matter is, it took me a long time because I would flip-flop on my reasoning behind that. The truth of the matter is that my dad had a bit of a criminal mind too, obviously. But my dad also just wanted to talk to his son. And me, being the asshole that I am, fed into that and manipulated the man into helping me escape prison. And that's how I escaped. Now, there's a point to this story. So what happens is I escape, of course. I'm gone for a few weeks. U.S. Marshals Campus, a 3-state area. They finally find my ass. End result is I spent we'll get to that, but I spent like 4 or 5 months in a county jail again. And at my sentencing, Secret Service is there, prosecutor, my public defender from another state, Kentucky this time. Prosecutor stands up, Your Honor, if you could take into consideration that Mr. Johnson was engaged yet again in identity theft and tax return fraud, we would appreciate that. The thing is they couldn't charge me with that because when they came in the hotel, they seized that shit without a warrant, meaning they could no longer use that evidence against me. I lucked out. The judge looks at him and says, no, not going to consider that. If you're going to charge him, you should have charged him. Then he looks at me. He's like, Mr. Johnson, I have no idea why you did the things you did, but it looks like by you keeping your mouth shut that you're saving yourself a serious charge. And I looked at him and I was like, yes, Your Honor. Then he picks up the PSR. Now, where the escape happened so soon after the initial sentencing out of South Carolina, they used the exact same PSR. Picks up the PSR, pre-sentence report. He's flipping through it. He's like, it also looks like before you got involved with all these drugs and alcohol, that you were a pretty good citizen. And I looked at him and I was like, yes, Your Honor. So he says, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you 15 additional months in prison. And I'm like this. He said, but I'm going to order the drug program for you. And I'm like,